Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Voices of AAPI Communities. We'll just wait just a moment to get started while people are entering the webinar. Perfect. So we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome again. My name is Sarah Sadwani. I'll be your moderator for today. Welcome to this month's Voices of AAPI Community Briefing with critical insights on timely policy issues impacting our nation. I'd of course like to thank our partners, AAPI Data, APIAVote, Asian American Journalists Association, and NCAPA for today's briefing, and of course the Associated Press and NORC for their ongoing partnership to collect this crucial data. The Voices of AAPI briefings are an incredibly important resource of data and insights for our communities regarding timely policy and social issues. And I'm thrilled to be welcoming some amazing speakers today, which we will hear from a little later. But first, I'd like to welcome Karthik Ramakrishnan, the founder and executive director of AAPI Data, to review the main findings of the survey. Karthik presents survey sample and top-line findings and disaggregated data charts, so there's plenty for us to be digging into today. So Karthik, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you everyone for joining us today. There's a lot to go through, but I'll talk about our top line findings and really looking forward to the expert panel that we have and the lively discussion that I'm sure we will have today. You can find findings not only from this survey, but also prior surveys in 2025 in our resource guides. So if you go to apidata.com/resource-guides or click on that QR code, you will see one place where we have our public opinion data broken out by theme and topic so that you can see it in a more handy way across surveys. This is something that we will continue to build, including our latest survey data in this ongoing resource guide. Next slide, please. So let's dive into it. By the way, one of the things I should note that even though we talk about our survey as a July survey, it was fielded in June and released in July. So here are some of the main findings. One is more API adults have an unfavorable view of Trump now than in December 2024. Essentially, Trump had a little bit of a honeymoon, and we'll talk about where that movement occurred, but that's gone back down now. When it comes to tariffs, 85% expect Trump's tariffs to increase the price of consumer goods. API adults are more concerned about the possibility of a US recession when compared to the general population. Next slide. They're also more likely than the general public. We have a bunch of questions on DEI, and we specifically mentioned the phrase DEI in trying to see where our community stands on these topics. Often you have assumptions made based on the affirmative action fight that our community would be opposed to DEI. But our findings here build on prior findings that we and others have found with significant support for DEI programs, including in colleges and universities. We have information about experiences with racism and discrimination, which remain high, but unfortunately, a low level of confidence in the government's ability to handle discrimination. And we do see a decline in reported experiences of hate crimes as well as overall hate incidents since October 2023, when we asked the question in an identical manner. And this, by the way, is reflective of other types of data, including FBI crime reports from 2021 versus where we are today. Next slide. So just to go a little bit deeper here. First, Trump is not favorable among API communities, and his unfavorability is higher than the US general population. And what you see here is both now as well as compared to the past. Let's go to the next slide. JD Vance is also not popular. Now, some people may wonder and speculate whether um, having Usha Vance as a South Asian, South Asian, it's not the first lady, second lady. Maybe I don't know if that's the right term. Might have given him a bit of a bump in terms of favorability. And we don't see much in the way of that. JD Vance's unfavorability remains fairly stable from before. In fact, it's gone up since December of 2024. Next slide. Elon Musk's favorability. Elon Musk is not in the news as much anymore, but his unfavorability is slightly higher than the US average. Next slide. We also asked about Robert F. Kennedy Jr. And potentially because our community pays more attention to issues pertaining to science and potentially on healthcare, we see RFK Jr.'s unfavorability significantly higher than the US average. Next slide. Next, in terms of tariffs and their potential impacts on the US economy, as well as other questions related to the US economy. API adults are less likely than the general population to say that tariffs will have a positive effect on manufacturing in the United States. Democrats and independents among APIs are similar in their beliefs. It's only API Republicans where over a majority, 64%, believe that tariffs will improve or increase US manufacturing. Next slide. When it comes to jobs, you see a lot more skepticism among API adults that tariffs will increase US jobs. Whereas the US population in general is split, 40% say increase, 38% say decrease. API adults are much more likely to say that it will decrease jobs in the US than increase jobs. Only 24% say that will increase jobs. And there is a significant partisan split here. But even among independents, right, only 24% say that it will increase jobs in the US. Next slide. In terms of the availability of consumer goods in the US, this is not a question that was asked of the general population by Associated Press and NORC, but we see a similar proportion say that tariffs will have a negative impact, and in this case, decreasing the availability of consumer goods in the United States. Next slide. Terms of the price of goods in the US, we see similar results with the US population and the API adult population, where a supermajority, in this case 85%, believe that tariffs will increase the price of consumer goods in the United States. Now, this is important to highlight because the latest inflation numbers show a persistence in inflation, but we haven't seen a big jump yet. But economists speculate that it's because of hoarding that a lot of companies did prior to the tariffs taking effect, and potentially the on again, off again nature of tariffs, where it might not yet be showing up in inflation numbers, but many expect it to start showing up in the coming months. Next slide. Now, looking beyond tariffs, we also asked other questions about the economy. And the way the question was worded was, how concerned are you about each of the following in the next few months? And we see a very high level of concern over the cost of groceries. 2/3 are either extremely concerned or very concerned. Next slide. Concern about the US going into a recession. We see very high levels of concern. Next slide. Concern over the cost of big purchases. So a majority there are extremely concerned or very concerned. And you see Democrats and independents of similar mind, and whereas API Republicans are less concerned about the cost of big purchases. Next slide. Concern over costs at international or ethnic grocery stores. We see Democrats and independents similar here, and overall 54% extremely concerned or very concerned, and only 15% not very concerned or not at all concerned. Next slide. And then concern over costs at minority-owned small businesses. 51% of API adults extremely concerned or very concerned, and only about 1 in 5 not very concerned or not at all concerned. And again, you see similar patterns among Democrats and independents, and it's only Republicans that have a statistically significant difference in their point of view. Next slide. Concern over the availability of consumer goods. A reminder, this doesn't ask them specifically about tariffs. And you see close to a majority there, 49% extremely concerned or very concerned. And again, you see a familiar pattern with Democrats and independents of similar mind and Republicans holding different opinions. Next slide. And then concern over the cost of eating out at ethnic restaurants. We see a slightly lower proportion here, 44%, extremely concerned or very concerned among API adults overall, with a majority of Democrats and independents expressing that point of view. Next slide. And then concern over the cost of direct shipping e-commerce sites. Maybe this is a little bit in the weeds. You don't see as elevated a level of concern in our community. Next slide. Next, with respect to DEI programs, we ask the United States has a diverse population with people of many different races, ethnicities, religions, and backgrounds. Do you think this diversity makes the country stronger, weaker, and or neither, right? And then people were asked whether it's much stronger or much weaker. And what we find is that API adults are more likely than the US adult population to say that diversity is a source of strength for the United States, 73%, as opposed to 60%. Bipartisanship, you see majority across the board, although it is weaker among Republicans who say that diversity makes the US stronger. Next slide. In terms of support for diversity, equity, and inclusion programs or DEI programs, we see that 58% strongly favor or somewhat favor, and that's much higher than the US average of 40%. There is a significant breakdown by party. And generally speaking, by the way, you have about a 2-to-1 ratio of Democrats over Republicans in terms of party identification, with about a quarter to 30%, depending on the survey, identifying as independent. So that gives you a sense. When you see the overall average, it tends to be between the independent and Democrat value because that's how our community is split in terms of partisanship. Next slide. Support for courses that teach about the history and legacy of racism in the United States. We see 62% of API adults compared to 44% of US adults think that they favor support courses that teach about the history and legacy of racism in the United States in colleges and universities. Next slide. In terms of support for students from underrepresented groups, such as student clubs and mentorship opportunities, we see that 66% of API adults, when compared to 48% of US adults, favor support for students for underrepresented groups in these kinds of opportunities. By the way, all of this is important. Lest people claim that Asian Americans, in fact, the administration has used Asian Americans and the Harvard case to try to attack DEI programs, whereas we see that Asian Americans and API adults both are much more likely than the US average to favor various types of DEI programs. Next slide. Finally, in terms of support for scholarships for students from underrepresented groups at colleges and universities, 63% strongly favor or somewhat favor compared to 45% of the US adult population, and a strong correlation based on partisanship. Next slide. Finally, in terms of DEI programs in the federal government, we asked, would you say diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, sometimes called DEI, have gone too far, not gone far enough, or been about right in each of the following areas? And we see that API adults say that it's either about right or not gone far enough, right? So if you add those two, you get close to 70% saying that it's either about right or not going far enough. Only 30% say that it's gone too far. Next slide. In terms of DEI programs in nonprofit or community serving organizations, you see a similar proportion. 27% say it's gone too far, whereas the rest say it's either about right or not gone far enough. Next slide. In corporations, again, similar findings. So about 30% say that it's gone too far. The vast majority say that it's about right or not gone far enough. In all of these, by the way, Republicans are the only ones that say that DEI programs have gone too far. Next slide. DEI programs in colleges and universities. So slightly higher proportion, but not statistically significant. 33% say that it's gone too far. And the remainder, so 2/3, say that it's either about right or not gone far enough. And again, you see this familiar partisanship pattern. Next slide. Next, with respect to experiences with hate as well as other types of discrimination, we see that 25% have experienced any type of hate incident that includes both hate crimes that are either violent acts or threats of violence, or other types of hate incidents that fall short of that, that include verbal harassment, being called a racial slur, and the rest of those indicators that you see there. Next slide. Now, we do see, using the exact same question wording and same survey methodology, a decrease from October of 2023, where about a third of API adults report any type of hate incident compared to a quarter today. Now, a quarter is still high, but I'll note that when it comes to hate crimes as well, you see a slight decrease from October 2023 to now in June of 2025 when the data were collected. And this is in line with the Universal Crime Report data from the Federal Bureau of Investigations, where you saw a big increase in reporting in 2021, and then a slow decline thereafter. So we have confidence in these data that seem to mirror what national reporting looks like, at least in terms of time trends, even though we know there's significant underreporting when it comes to official crime statistics. Next slide. Now, other types of discrimination. What's great here in our partnership with Associated Press and NORC is we're able to make comparisons between API adults and the general population on several questions like these. And one thing I should note is that the US adult population, that data is a few years old now. So hopefully Associated Press and NORC will replicate that study or those questions in the near future so we can get more that are time proximate. But in terms of discrimination when applying for jobs, you see close to 40% say that they often experience it or sometimes experience it, compared to 28% for the US adult population. Notably, only 32% say never among API adults compared to 52% for US adults. Next slide. Discrimination when shopping in stores or in shopping malls. Again, you see a greater proportion of API adults say that they face discrimination, especially when you combine the often and sometimes together. 35% say they experience this, that they experienced this in the past. Actually, so I guess, no, it didn't say in the past 12 months. It just says how often they experience it. Next slide. In terms of discrimination when dealing with the police, you don't see much variation among those that say often and sometimes. So you have 26%, so about a quarter of the population, that they experience discrimination when dealing with the police often or sometimes. But you do see a higher proportion among US adults say they never experience this, 58% versus 43% for API adults. Next slide. And then finally, when discrimination when receiving healthcare, you see a similar proportion that say often or sometimes. So about 1 in 5 API adults say they often or sometimes experience discrimination when receiving healthcare. But the proportion that say never is lower for the API population than for US adults. Next slide. In terms of how serious of a problem racism is in the US, we see that a majority, 53%, say that it's an extremely serious problem or very serious problem. But this does vary by partisanship, with Republicans much less likely to say that this is an extremely serious problem or a very serious problem. Next slide. When we asked the same in October 2023, we found similar results and similar patterns by partisanship. Next slide. Finally, we asked about how confident people were in the government's ability to handle discrimination in these various domains. And we found some sobering findings. The majority are not very confident or not at all confident in the government's ability to handle discrimination when it comes to healthcare. Next slide. Similarly, a majority are not confident in the government's ability to handle employment discrimination. Next slide. Similarly, on housing discrimination, 55% say not very confident or not at all confident. Next slide. And then finally, on law enforcement, an even greater proportion, 62% say that they're not very confident or not at all confident in the government's ability to handle discrimination when it comes to law enforcement. So before I turn it over to Sarah and the rest of the panel, these are sobering findings. It might be seen as obvious when people might say, well, of course, you would not expect this administration to be credible when it comes to handling charges of discrimination, but this is the law. This is what government is supposed to do. When people are being discriminated against, the government is supposed to provide remedy. And so it's very sobering. When you combine the data in terms of how frequently people experience discrimination in these domains and in their lack of confidence in the ability of government to handle discrimination in those various domains. So with that, I'll turn it over to Sarah and the rest of the panel.
Great. Thank you so much, Karthik, for running us through all of this really important data with some fascinating findings on things like unfavorability, the impact of the economy and tariffs, DEI, hate crimes, discrimination, and racism. I'm sure we have a lot to get into with our experts that are joining us today. I want to introduce our panel of gentlemen, as I see all of the photos there. Of course, first we'll start with Jason Pagiao, a chair of the California Commission on Asian Pacific Islander American Affairs, Bob Sakaniwa from APIAVote, who serves as the Director of Policy and Advocacy, and Greg Orton, joining us again from the National Council of Asian Pacific Americans and serving as the National Director. I suppose just to start us off, if each of you could just share some of your initial reactions to this data that we're seeing, a little bit different from some of the other kinds of questions that we've been asking in survey data previously. So I'd love to get your initial reactions before we jump into a greater deep dive. And I'll also say for those of us joining us online, please feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A box. We'll have a discussion here, but then we'll move directly to those questions. So please feel free to drop them in and we'll be taking a look at those. Jason, do you want to start us off and just share some of your initial feedback and reflections on seeing this data?
Yeah, sure. Taking a look at this, and over the course of the past few months, we've been doing a few different surveys, both in various regions throughout the state of California, and then more recently have been doing them in the end of the first quarter, and up until about a month ago, closer to the border region here in San Diego County. And to put a little bit in perspective of how I'm seeing this and how it affects the state of California, at least for Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander businesses, the impact of those businesses to the state of California is over $200 billion in economic impact to the state of California. And if you look at that, that is 1/3 of all Asian American jobs or small businesses throughout the nation. So taking a look at that and looking at some of this information, I mean, I would say that the findings confirm a lot of what our members are reporting, even for our small business development center and the cultural programs we have layered on top of it, that confidence is deteriorated. Only about 13% of small businesses, in a region say they feel confident in staying afloat. That number drops even further among API-owned businesses under around a $75,000 household income. So it's no longer a short-term concern. It's a systemic shift is what I'm seeing.
Wow, that's fascinating. And those are some large numbers of folks that are facing these kinds of concerns. And we'll come back and dig a little deeper into that. Bob, do you want to share what some of your initial reflections on this data that you're seeing?
Sure. And thanks so much for having me on the panel again. And I'm very glad that Sarah is moderating. It's not often that a panel is all guys these days, so you're saving us from being completely one-sided in that regard. But no, I think this survey really underscores for me, anyways. How what we're seeing on the ground is really reflective in these polls that have been taken. And, from November of 2024 to where we are today, and everything, that's happened in between, really from the national level down, I think is underscored by this survey in the various areas. Obviously, we didn't do any questioning on immigration policies in this particular survey, but I think it's implicated in everything that we see in these results. And so I look forward to kind of digging deeper into some of these issues. But I think the survey itself really kind of helps to confirm a lot of the things we've been seeing.
Yeah, great. Thanks for that, Bob. Greg, how about yourself? Are there concerns that these insights maybe raise for you, or maybe even opportunities that you see from this data?
Sure. Thanks, Aaron. Always glad to be sharing some space with you online to have this conversation. Thanks to API Data and all the partners for bringing us together. For me, I would just put a finer point on what both my colleagues have shared. Yeah, when I really took a look at this data and think about it today, we are witnessing in real time this massive economic sort of realignment and correction in real time, right? And so when tariffs were first brought up as sort of part of an economic tool that the Trump administration was going to pursue, in the early days of this administration, there was a lot of conversation and discourse around the impact. We weren't quite sure. We were waiting to see sort of how it all played out. Fast forward to today, we're starting to feel that. And I think all of this survey data reflects that for our community in particular, the impact is particularly acute. I think it's fair, and it would be the right approach to think about how tariffs are impacting different regions, different industries. But for our community, certainly, as Jason pointed out, there's so many small businesses that rely on stable supply chains, right? Borrowing costs, everything that it takes to run a business. When there's disruptions, that makes running that business that much harder. And so I think, the sentiment that we're seeing in these surveys reflect the fact that now that these tariffs have been ongoing, we've heard lots of different narratives around it. Sometimes even the White House itself seems to contradict itself or be fairly arbitrary in terms of how they're setting those policies. I think consumer confidence, the confidence of small businesses and producers, we're starting to see that more acutely simply because we've had more time to actually process it. The economy is again trying to keep up. I suspect we'll see more of it as we move forward. Another point that we had talked about, and certainly this stands out to me, is that that survey data around confidence in the government's ability to handle or address discrimination. And for us, everybody on the Zoom webinar knows we've been talking about this stuff for a very long time, even before Donald Trump took office again. And to see those numbers dip even further, in my mind, is a direct reflection of the policy changes that the administration has decided to pursue. You can't haul out public health and public education and not expect folks to start to lose confidence in that. You can't dismantle or demonstrate that the DOJ might be more and more politicized and expect people not to feel like they may be more at risk of discrimination. And so I do think all of these trends seem to tie directly into the policy changes we've seen, and I expect that to continue.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks for that. Let's maybe start by digging into the first point that you raised, Greg, and maybe Jason, if you can weigh in on this. We were talking about the tariffs and this massive impact it's had. Certainly, even within my own community of Indians of a Sindhi background, which is a very specific sort of ethnic group. I would say probably at least a quarter or a third of Sindhis in the United States actually are in the import-export business. I can say just anecdotally from even within my own family that the back and forth on the tariffs has raised uncertainty to extreme levels about the impact that it's going to have. Jason, tell us a little bit more about the broad array of small business owners that you're working with, and maybe you can dig a little deeper in to tell us a little bit more about this lack of consumer confidence that you're seeing. And you offered some staggering numbers about even having concerns about being able to stay afloat. Maybe you could share a little bit more about what you're seeing on the ground.
Yeah, sure. Every single day we have full-time business advisors that provide um, basically counseling to any of our businesses who seek the support, and it's in language, and the feedback is consistent across all sectors. The tariff increase cost, all the uncertainties you mentioned that's been made from it. It's made, sourcing less predictable. The intent may have been global, but the impact, as we always say, is local, right? And very specifically, we had one small business who, does a lot of shipping, an incredible amount of shipping to Asia, to 2 different countries, and they were going to ship a few different pallets one day, and then the policies changed the next. If they had waited just one more day, they wouldn't have eaten all the costs related to what they had loaded on the day before when the policies had shifted. So those day-to-day changes definitely shrink or limit the confidence that a lot of small businesses have. So, and that is reflective too in the views of government performance, right? We look at approval ratings tell a significant part of the story. The deeper shift is functional. Businesses today ask one question: will this policy help me operate tomorrow? And if the answer is unclear, the trust erodes, and that's the environment we're in now. So it's not ideological; it's transactional for a lot of these small businesses. And where we saw trust erode in the local elected officials is that when they can't manage or deal with federal policies and don't know how they get implemented at the local level, and there's no support there or anything creative, folks aren't really doing any level of ideation in terms of how to solve these problems like we were able to see in the pandemic. It just makes it that much more difficult to trust the policymakers or those that are going to hopefully help us and our small businesses get out of the situations they're in right now as a result of these policies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely. And I know Greg had also raised, and this survey, we didn't exactly look at immigration, though certainly we have done that in the past. And that's kind of an ongoing question that we tend to ask in these surveys. But I would imagine that even the immigration raids are impacting small business owners as well, with many of their workers being scared to even come to work, or a fear that warehouses or other places of business, car washes, etc., where workers are going to be picked up. So I can only imagine the amount of fear, and I take that point very seriously, right? That this is really a transactional kind of perspective that folks are bringing to this. Just shifting gears a little bit, Greg, as for NCAPA, as a national coalition of Asian American and Pacific Islander serving organizations from across the country, this data also reveals this overall pessimism about our economic future, and in particular, this heightened concern about AAPIs, about this possibility of a recession, which you began to touch a little bit on. What are you hearing from groups on the ground? What are any regional differences that you have maybe been picking up on, or do you find this to really be a widespread sentiment across the nation?
Yeah, I think it's an excellent question. And first, I want to give a shout out to National ACE, one of our member organizations. They're working directly in the small API small business community, trying to make sure resources are available. They're effective in terms of doing their best in engaging with this current administration. And so I know that they've been working hard every single day, not just to keep us updated in terms of the work they're doing, but also make sure that API small businesses are represented as best they can here in Washington, D.C. And I would say, again, there's certainly going to be some regional differences in terms of I believe people's view of the impact of tariffs. There are communities that in different parts of the country where the tariffs may help. Like we should be honest about that. But again, I can't help but just come back to the fact that we know so many API small businesses exist, and that's quite honestly how much of our community is sort of driven economically. And so there's no question of the impact that it's having, again, as we've talked about. And so I would say from an organizational sort of broader civil rights landscape perspective, something to keep in mind is when the economy shrinks or when consumer confidence goes down, oftentimes that's seen and the impact is felt in the nonprofit community and those of us who are doing this work, right? There's less, when businesses are struggling, there's less money going out there in terms of philanthropic efforts. And oftentimes that makes it much more difficult for us to not only continue the work, but find ways to be effective in representing the community. And so I would say our groups, certainly the members of NCAPA, have felt the sort of economic pressure that the country is experiencing right now. We've seen philanthropy across the board pull back. And as API data and others have documented in other places, we know uh, sort of how poorly philanthropy oftentimes shows up for our community groups. And so I think it's compounded there. I think another perspective that I encourage folks to think about is while the administration and by and large the Republican Party is projecting confidence and unity around a lot of these economic decisions with the Trump tax plan plus the tariffs. Behind the scenes and even we're starting to see more publicly, some of that confidence is starting to fray a little bit. Certainly, oh, sorry, looks like the automatic lights went out, but I'll keep going. So you don't see me waiting frantically over here. I think some of that confidence is fraying. You won't see in the news Republicans necessarily battling the Trump administration on tariffs as much, but we have heard and seen plenty of bills and quietly behind the scenes in DC. Both Republicans and Democrats are trying to figure out ways to exempt their states and their communities from these tariffs. And to me, that's a clear signal that again, when you move past the political ideology of everything and how bogged down our political system has become in that, there's a real recognition that these tariffs are going to do real harm. And right. And so regardless of Republican, Democrat, representatives, senators are trying to figure out ways to insulate their own communities from that. And so to me, that certainly stands out. And for me, it goes back to this idea that first stat that Karthik mentioned, where we're talking about the sort of disapproval rate of Trump overall has just increased over time. I think that's a direct reflection of just again, on one hand, they're projecting strength and stability, but all of what we're feeling as a community is instability, right? And uncertainty and sometimes changing messages. So that's certainly something that our groups and I think groups on the ground are feeling too.
Yeah. That's great. And I want to pick up on that thread around unfavorability and bring Bob into the as well. APIAVote, of course, is known for its excellent mobilizing voters to the polls. In 2024, though, we, of course, a shift in voter support towards Trump and Vance. Given these low rates of approval for the current administration, what do you make of that? How do you think that's going to continue to play out over the next year as we start moving towards the 2026?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question, and I do think that there was a shift in 2024 where I think more independent and middle persuadable API voters. We did see a shift towards Trump. I don't know that it was any more significant than any of the other groups in that regard, but obviously enough to put him in the White House. But I think a lot of that was, driven by exactly what, we're talking about right now in terms of, how he was perceived in terms of being able to handle the economy and being a quote unquote businessman, notwithstanding all the bankruptcies and everything else. But there was just a perception that was going to be his focus, and people were still feeling the effects of inflation and everything else. So I think there was this image and idea that this was going to be a vote about the economy. At the same time, I don't think he hid anything regarding his stance on immigration policy. Sorry to keep going back to that, but I think it did impact the way API voters, who shifted in that direction, voted, and none of this was hidden. It was all, in fact, out there in Project 2025, exactly what the game plan was going to be. And then fast forward 6-7 months where we are today, and people are realizing, wait a second, he said he was going to fix the economy, and all we have is the instability, which is, of course, a killer for business planning and everything else, created by his on again, off again hardline approach on tariffs, and oh, I'll make a decision in 2 weeks, and all of that creating this uncertainty, and therefore the economy not picking up the way people thought, and at the same time, rather than what a lot of the uh, people in the API community heard, which was he would only go after the worst of the worst in terms of immigration enforcement. What we see is the community under attack in that regard as well, regardless of whether you could be a green card holder and caught up in this indiscriminate, outright hostility towards immigration and immigrants that this administration has, and they're hell bent on deporting as many people as they can under the thinnest of excuses. So I think that's having an impact on many communities, and the combination of feeling like oh, the economy isn't being improved, and uh, immigration being kind of enforcement only at this point, really uh, has begun to change people's views, and it's reflected again in his favorability rating in this current survey, I think.
I want to bring in, we have a whole bunch of questions actually happening in the chat. I want to bring some of those into the conversation. And specifically, Bob, I think back for you, Cam had asked, are we seeing shifts like what we see here in battleground states and the red states? Are we seeing any specific kinds of shifts or movement in places like Florida and Texas? And those, of course, have also been places that we've heard a whole lot about. Texas, of course, talking about redistricting the state prior to the 2026 election. But we know Asian Americans, of course, have played an enormous role in many of those swing districts in the Houston areas and Dallas and other places. Are you seeing any of that kind of movement or momentum?
I think that's a great point, because AAPIs do make essentially the margin of victory in many of the battleground states that you just mentioned. And while we don't know the exact how it's going to play out exactly, the feeling is, for instance, in Texas, they just passed the alien land law that will directly harm Chinese Americans, as well as Asian Americans in general, who may run into problems because they're perceived to be of that ethnicity or what have you. I think all of these things in the immigration enforcement context are also starting to really affect people's views on the current administration. And while we don't know exactly how this is going to play out, it's really up to all the organizations that are part of NCAPA, us included, to really focus on our voter education efforts about what's going on, about why some of these issues are playing out the way they are playing out, in order to really see, how this how people's sentiments will be reflected in the polls, especially with the midterms coming up in a year and a half. I think that's really going to be a crucial time to make sure people understand exactly what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. And you had mentioned earlier, Project 2025, and how we've seen in some of these polls that there were a lot of APIs that had actually supported Trump's immigration ideas. And it's one thing, I think, to support these ideas, but then to actually see them in action, to see the video footage of people being taken off the streets. Gabriel put in the chat that 18 Filipino Americans were deported in Norfolk, Virginia. And certainly we've heard these kind of stories all over the country. And so I think it will be a really, really important piece to see how that continues to play out. Gabriel had also mentioned or asked about how state governments can fill in, what role state governments might be playing. Jason, I'm wondering for you in the business community, are you seeing government, California for you, but perhaps in other places, other state governments, filling in some of the gaps that people are seeing, helping to boost any levels of confidence among business owners or even around consumer confidence? Is that something that you have thought about at all?
I would say that even from the perspective of California very specifically, and speaking to the commission and the work that we do and partner with the legislature and the governor, I would say that we're probably among the more creative, and maybe that's partly due to the sheer economic force and the populations that we have in the state. And so, we have a lot of partners in other states as well that have API commissions. And so for us, looking at addressing specifically the economic impacts, or let's say with regard to disasters, there are some pretty creative bills that have come out. One was from Assembly member Jessica Caloza from Los Angeles, who put together a bill, Assembly Bill 265, which addressed some of the wildfires and issues there, and being able to action things that would allow not to wait for the administration federally to declare disaster. And this is to help nonprofits and small businesses, but to allow the governor at a different threshold to be able to access funds that would allow those small businesses and nonprofits to be able to access emergency disaster funds from the state, as well as receive technical assistance from a lot of the providers throughout the state. So I think having reactions and things like that that could help us not just throughout the state, but being able to action that in local places where you might see a lot of the different issues that come from federal policies or just even natural disasters. Our community tends to suffer more in that we don't necessarily have everything that's in language, and we don't have things that are culturally responsive or even tailored for our community. So it costs more and it takes more time to communicate to our community. And so when these things happen and we respond to a lot of these issues, we need more, I think, creative and collaborative partners and throughout whatever region you're in, and particularly the state. So, and I think some of the things that a couple others had mentioned regarding, how do we, what is our duty or role, whether it's the government or a nonprofit provider or a commission. And I think a lot of it is be able to address, and our commission had certainly made the point before, that when we were looking at everything that was affecting us in the immediate and that seemed dire, is what does our community need now, and what do they need immediately, and what can we provide to them, and what is the obligation of the state to do so, and starting there, and then being able to action policies and work with the legislature to create policies that can transcend a lot of these issues and be able to allocate resources. So I think it's a multi-pronged conversation that requires a lot of different partners, but also a lot of creative thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm so glad to hear that you're a part of that creative thinking here in California. And certainly, I think we even saw many of these similar kinds of issues really being highlighted during COVID, the need to reach out to various small business owners, having language access, cultural competence from the government in order to create some of those kinds of partnerships. Greg or Bob, any other thoughts you want to weigh in terms of state government roles that you might be seeing? Or Karthik as well.
I'll defer to Bob, just simply because NCAPA typically focuses up here at the national level, and certainly our members do some local work, but and we support them in that. But I'll turn it over to Bob on that one.
Sure, and we're also obviously a national organization, but we have many community partners throughout the country, and I think there is a huge role for state governments to play, but obviously, depending on your the makeup of the assembly and who's in the governor's mansion, that's going to make a huge impact. And California is fortunate They even the governor there is even talking about, well, if Texas is going to redistrict, we're going to redistrict. And so, there is in the right states, plenty that the states can do to kind of be a backstop and help out. But at the same time, there are plenty of state governments that are lockstep with the federal government as it is made up right now, and that's a huge problem. Many states where they want to get involved with immigration enforcement and work hand in hand with ICE and things like that. So it really does depend. And even in those states where maybe it's not so great at the state level, local government may be a little more understanding, being closer to where the action is happening, that there may be opportunities to partner at that more local level, but certainly there are opportunities to especially now to work with state and local governments where it makes sense.
So I'll just jump in very quickly here. So, right, in addition to being a survey researcher, I do work on federalism. And yes to all of that, but also let's just be cognizant that what this administration is doing and what the Supreme Court seems to be allowing is a lot more federal limitation on states than before. You're not supposed to have commandeering, and yet you have federal agencies that are using their power to grab state data on Medicaid and SNAP to do immigration enforcement. We're seeing other instances, including in California, where the president released water that was unnecessary and, in fact, experts say will be harmful during the summer and the dry season, releasing water from the Central Valley that has no bearing on the fires that were happening in LA, and also holding federal aid hostage in friendly places versus unfriendly places. So, the word unprecedented keeps getting thrown around quite a bit, but it is something. One of the things, the founders had separation of powers and federalism as two major checks on tyranny. And I'm not saying this as a wild-eyed person. I'm saying this as a political scientist trained in our federalist system. It should be concerning to everyone, regardless of one's party, when you start seeing this weakening of state protections. And so that is something I think is quite sobering. And it's something that I think we need to raise public awareness on. Sarah, and there's a bunch of questions. We might need to do a speed round on what's left.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, I think many of the last questions that have come in have been around the 2026 elections. And so I want to throw out some broad questions about what kinds of voter education might be used, what kinds of strategies specifically to AAPIVote might be used, and also a question from someone who is anonymous on here asking about the kinds of issues that are going to be winning issues or even messages. Are they practical things like kitchen table issues, particularly seeing the level of concern folks have around the economy? Or are they something more so based on ideals or principles? And so I'll kick that back to all of you if you want to weigh in on thoughts as we come closer to the 2026 election as kind of a final thought, perhaps, as we begin to close out this hour.
Yeah, one quick thing I'll say, folks, this is a C3 conversation. So meaning that it's about voter education. As an academic person, I can certainly weigh in beyond that. Randall Yip also asked an important question about whether it's Trump voters that are souring. So Randall, we don't, because it's a survey of API adults, but also beyond that, there have been, for various reasons, Associated Press does not favor the who did you vote for in the last election as a way to peg it. We know there's a very strong correlation between partisanship and that. And so for me, when you see the decline in favorability among Republicans since December of 2024, that's something to watch out for. Also, a significant decline among independents. Where Trump made gains, he already had the support of Republicans. Where he made gains was among independents, and we're seeing a significant drop there. So it's not a smoking gun to say, here's a Trump voter who has buyer's remorse. We have to do a little bit of connecting the dots there, but that's there. And then finally, in terms of the issues, I think that's going to be one of the big questions If it is kitchen table, if it is about the economy, I think economic performance a year from now will be big. But even based on this bill that just passed, we had a survey a couple of months ago which showed that our community does not believe in cutting taxes for the wealthy, believes in tax relief for lower income and middle class folks, does not believe in reducing healthcare spending, in fact, says we need to address the cost of healthcare. We're going to see how that all plays out. So I think this notion of a kitchen, I think in many ways it will be a referendum on what Trump ran on the last time, which was supposed to be economic relief. And we will see if that indeed is the case. But on top of that, I'll just flag for what Bob said. Even as we saw more conservative opinion drift in our community on immigration, we're seeing a lot of people pushing back against this overreach when it comes to ICE raids. And Jason, yesterday when we were on a panel together, you talked about how small businesses are concerned, how it's actually not just an immigrant rights issue conventionally understood. So that I think is going to be really important to figure out what is the general mood and whether people feel that this country, if this country is going in the right direction economically, but also in terms of fundamental human rights.
Great. Perfect. Thank you so much for that, Karthik. And yes, even in some of my own research, I was looking recently, unpublished as of yet, but on messages that work in the API community on in the environment. And what we ultimately are finding is those economic messages tend to be far more effective at shifting opinions on things like global warming, climate change, et cetera, than more justice-oriented messaging. Certainly something that we saw in many ways in the 2024 election, but no doubt will continue to be a key component of whether you're Democrat or Republican of the kind of messaging that we're going to see in 2026, especially given these concerns around the economy that we're picking up already this summer in 2025. We are just about at time for our panelists. Would any of you like to make a final word? Any last closing thoughts for all of our guests today as we close out our conversation on all of this incredible data that we've been collecting? Greg?
I'd just like to say thank you again to everyone for spending time with us. I mean, we will hopefully be able to continue to work with API data and others in producing these sort of surveys. The data will continue to sort of signal where our community is headed. And I agree. I think we're entering next year, and we're a C3 as well, but there'll be some interesting questions that emerge just because of all the changes that this administration has chosen to either the rules they've chosen to rewrite or the limits they're choosing to push. I think historically the economy has always been the biggest question, but we'll see if some of these, again, major changes are starting to come across the radar of voters as well.
I would just say thank you to Sarah for moderating this so well. And I think Karthik really summed everything up very well there at the end. But one thing I wanted to underscore that Greg had mentioned previously regarding, C3s and the funding crisis. I think, for many of our organizations, it's about survival even before they can start thinking about 2026. So I think it's 1 month at a time for a lot of our rank and file out there. So we should do all we can to support your local nonprofits. But yeah, I think the challenges are definitely yet to come.
I'm going to ask Jason to go, and then I'll close.
Sure. I'm so appreciative of this, Karthik and Sarah, for this opportunity to delve into this data and bring in the economic lens on this. And I will say that there are, as much as there are concerns in this data, there's a lot of opportunities as well. I mean, the concern is urgency fatigue. A lot of our small businesses have been operating under stress since 2020. They now see recession signals, tariff pressures, workforce gaps converging all over again. But I do believe that there's opportunity if we focus. The businesses we work with don't expect perfection. They expect clarity, and they want decisions that move at their speed. And I think if we focus on those things, our outcomes might be more helpful for our small businesses and our very diverse communities. So thanks.
Yeah, and I'll just close by saying, people wonder, does data and evidence matter? And I think especially when it comes to community opinion, it's really important to see the way our community shifts. And our communities, when they shift, they don't just go and then never shift back. One of the things I think when we talk about a fast-growing and dynamic population with generally lower partisanship, they care about performance, and they also are paying attention to what's going on in the world around them. And so I hope that more journalists cover our community, but also for the rest of you, we have future studies coming up. We're excited about a new survey that we're developed with NCAPA that'll be out in September. And then the next AP NORC study will be out in October. I know that Jason and the California Commission is putting on an economic summit. It's focused on California, but I really think it's going to have national implications. I think it's so important for us to keep the civic dialogue going, and that even and especially in an in a kind of hyper news cycle environment where it's really hard to pierce through. I just think we need to have consistency and just keep hammering what our community's values are, what our priorities are, and insist that people in power in DC, in Sacramento, and everywhere else pay attention to us. So, and really grateful, Sarah, for your leadership. I saw you when, Bob, when you mentioned that redistricting might be back on the agenda. Sarah used to chair the California Redistricting Commission and is working on a book related to that experience. So I don't know, Sarah, if you're ready to be called back into service, but hopefully we can have some rest among all the craziness that's about us.
Yeah, no, absolutely. My sense is they won't calling me to treat the lines. In any case, but for a conversation for another day, no doubt. I want to thank all of our panelists for being here with us today and sharing all of your fantastic expert insights. Karthik Ramakrishnan, of course, Greg Orton, Bob Sakaniwa, Jason Pagiao, thank you so much for being here. And thank you to everyone for tuning in. We had nearly 100 people from across the nation today joining us. Thank you for your engagement and participation in today's briefing. Please continue to stay up to date on the latest findings at AAPI Data and the AP NORC websites. All of this data and much, much more is available there. And as always, feel free to reach out with any questions. Thanks so much and have a great day.